look around today and look at the situation where our young men and women are coming back from overseas service, I can't help thinking to myself, look, we've got to catch this early. If they suffered a trauma, and if their family are finding that their husband, brother, daughter, wife, whatever, if they're acting inappropriately and acting out of the norm, to please come and get help, because I desperately don't want any serviceman or woman to go through what I went through and lose so much.
Right, our final session this afternoon is a plenary session titled Comparing the Prevalence and Nature of Mental Health Problems in Defence and Fire and Emergency Services, which will be presented by Dr. Miranda van Hooff. Miranda is the Director of Research at the Centre for Traumatic Stress Studies, University of Adelaide, and is an expert in conducting large-scale population-based longitudinal studies of traumatised and at-risk populations. Since 2009, her research has focused on the prevalence of mental disorder in the Australian Defence Force and emergency service personnel. She is currently the CIA for the Transition and Wellbeing Research Program, a comprehensive $3.1 million study funded by the Department of Defence and the Department of Veteran Affairs. This program examines the impact of contemporary military service on the mental, physical and social health of serving and ex-serving Australian Defence Force personnel and their families. Please welcome Dr. Miranda van Hooff.
Thank you everyone for staying around for this afternoon's session. Today I'm going to provide a snapshot of mental health within two occupational settings, the Australian Defence Force and the South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service. Both studies from which this data was drawn examine the mental, physical and social health, as well as the prevalence of diagnosable mental disorders in the entire population. And this is really the most unique part of the research that we do. Because we have demographic and, in this instance, service characteristics for the ADF of both respondents and non-respondents, we've been able to provide weighted estimates of disorder which were representative of the complete workforce. The first study, conducted in collaboration with the Department of Defence in 2010 to 2012, combined data from 3 cohorts of Australian Defence Force personnel. All of these personnel participated in the MILHOP, which is the Military Health Outcomes Program of Research. The first group were regular reservists and ex-serving ADF personnel who were deployed to the Middle East between 2001 and 2009. The second group were all ADF members deploying to the Middle East between June 2010 and returning to Australia by June 2012. And the third group were all regular ADF personnel serving in 2010 who had never deployed to the Middle East. The 2010 ADF Mental Health Prevalence and Wellbeing Study examined all ADF personnel who were regular serving members at the time of survey completion, so basically combined up all of these 3 groups. The second study examined the mental, physical and social health of the entire South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service and recruited participants from 2 nominal roles. The first was all currently serving full-time MFS personnel, which there was 830, which we are calling our career firefighters. And the second group were all currently serving retained MFS personnel. So these mostly comprise those who are on call or in regional command positions. A sample of retired fighters were also drawn, but we eventually excluded them from the analysis because of low response rates. Both studies estimated the prevalence of 12-month and lifetime ICD-10 disorder using the same 2-phase design. In phase 1, participants are screened for mental health problems, psychological distress, physical symptoms and lifetime stresses using a self-report questionnaire. And this is done either online or in hard copy, and it's designed to take no more than about 45 to 60 minutes. Based on certain demographic information and scores on the screening questionnaires, in particular the K10 and the audit, a subsample were then selected in phase 2 to undertake a comprehensive telephone interview of lifetime and current mental disorder, according to the World Mental Health Initiative version of the Composite International Diagnostic Interview. Data from all survey responders were then weighted, as I previously mentioned, using key demographic and service characteristics to be representative of each entire workforce. The self-report questionnaire included a number of validated measures of mental health, and the ones that we typically use here are the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale, or the K10, the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist, or the PCL, the Patient Health Questionnaire, or the PHQ, and the Alcohol Use Identification Test, or the audit. In addition, we included a number of validated measures to examine a range of factors, including help seeking, stigma and barriers to care, physical health, quality of life, trauma exposure, and suicidal ideation and behaviour. Overall, the survey response rates on both studies were quite comparable. So for the ADF, of the 50,049 regular ADF members we invited to participate, 24,481 completed the self-report survey either online or in hard copy. And 1798 of these participants went on to complete a 1-hour interview about their 12-month and lifetime ICD-10 disorders. For the MFS, obviously the South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service is a lot smaller. It's just over 1,000 people, and we had 578 MFS members complete the survey, which is about 54.5% of the entire population, and 369 went on to complete the city interview. So there were some slight differences in the demographic characteristics of the two populations. The ADF had a high proportion of females, and was slightly younger overall, and in contrast the MFS had a higher proportion of married personnel, and they had served for a greater number of years. We know from the literature that there is a strong relationship between cumulative trauma exposure and adverse psychological outcomes, including both PTSD and depression. Previously, military studies, for example, have reported increased rates of probable depression and post-traumatic stress disorder post-deployment in those with multiple pre-deployment traumas. Interestingly, there is also an increasing body of literature to suggest that a significant proportion of trauma victims do not have their maximal stressor response in the immediate aftermath of the event, but rather their symptoms progressively increase over time. In some individuals, the apparent adverse consequences of the stress exposure lies dormant for a long period of time before some intercurrent adversity leads to its manifestation. This is a real risk for both the ADF and emergency services personnel in general, particularly due to the lack of predictability in terms of when and where such symptoms may arise, as well as their ongoing exposure to trauma. Given this background, the next series of slides compare the prevalence of lifetime trauma in the ADF, which is in blue, with the Metropolitan Fire Service, which is in orange, and an Australian sample, which is in yellow. Now, this Australian sample has been demographically matched to the ADF only, so obviously mostly males, all were employed, etc. So none of these comparisons are statistically compared, but I just thought I'd put them onto the same graph so you could roughly see how they look against each other. Interestingly, when we break down lifetime traumas to specific trauma types, we see a slightly different trauma history in the ADF compared to the MFS. So although we see very little differences between the two occupations in relation to both civilian war experiences, such as being a refugee or a civilian in a war zone, and non-intimate interpersonal traumas like being physical assaulted, stalked and being held captive, the ADF as a whole reports slightly higher rates of intimate interpersonal trauma. And this is things like rape, sexual assault, witnessing domestic violence. And it's slightly higher than both the Australian population and the Metropolitan Fire Service. Both the Metropolitan Fire Service and the ADF report higher rates of sexual assault than the Australian population. And I really must emphasise here that these rates haven't been compared statistically, and nor do they suggest that these events occurred following enlistment or during military service. So this is a lifetime history of trauma and may have preceded their enlistment in the military or the MFS. In contrast, the MFS report higher rates of non-interpersonal trauma. So this includes things like witnessing someone being badly injured or killed, and 76% of the population were exposed to this. Witnessing mass carnage, atrocities or mutilated bodies, which 43% of the MFS was exposed to this. Both natural and man-made disasters, and being exposed to a toxic chemical. For example, 96% of the MFS workforce in South Australia have witnessed death as a part of their work duties. 76% have rendered assistance to an injured victim, and 71% have been exposed and actively involved in providing assistance to others during a natural disaster. Sorry. This, I expect, may be accounted for by the fact that in contrast to the ADF personnel who generally only deploy for a discrete period of time, emergency service personnel such as firefighters are regularly exposed to a multitude of traumatic events, often and sometimes repeatedly on a daily basis. So they go on call out upon call out upon call out over the course of a day. These events are not the types of events that ADF personnel see on a daily basis, unless, of course, they are deployed, are in border protection or engaging in humanitarian or disaster relief. It may also reflect the diverse range of occupations within the ADF compared to the Metropolitan Fire Service. In saying this, the professional culture and context is paramount to acknowledge here. MFS personnel, like military personnel, as a part of their training, are provided with the skills to physically process these kinds of events. It is their role, it's what they're trained to do. As a consequence of this selection and training, in general, firefighters appear, and no doubt feel, competent, comfortable and confident rendering assistance in these environments. Hence, it is always important to acknowledge the professional culture in which trauma occurs, as not all events are equal across individuals, cultures or situations. Organisational leadership can further support the workforce in dealing with these events by following up with their personnel in the aftermath of critical incidents. And we've heard a lot today about peer support programs, and this is certainly something that organisations can do to support this. Interestingly, 76% of the fire service reported being threatened on the job, and 50% have experienced an injury on the job. So these events are a little different to the other events listed, particularly in the context of the fire service. Unlike the other events, these events involve implicit threat, sometimes life threat, and have the potential to restrict the MFS members' ability to effectively complete the immediate task at hand, and also to effectively support their work colleagues in the instance that it happens. Although somewhat expected, MFS personnel do not sign up to being threatened or injured. This is another situation where it's extremely important to consider the index event when considering post-trauma symptomatology, as it can often be the unexpected or unanticipated events that can lead to PTSD. Other traumatic events, such as having someone close die unexpectedly and having someone close experience a traumatic experience themselves, are also more common in MFS personnel, and I expect this probably represents co-worker trauma. War-related traumatic events, on the other hand, not surprisingly, were considerably more prominent in the ADF compared to both the MFS and the Australian population. There's no surprise there, really. So how does this translate into actual rates of disorder? And a couple of other speakers today have touched on this. Major General Adam Findlay did report some of the results of this. This will be a little bit more detailed than that. At some stage in their life, just over 50% of ADF members and just under 50% of MFS members and the Australian population have experienced an anxiety, affective or an alcohol disorder. In general, MFS rates aren't too dissimilar from the Australian population, whereas ADF rates are slightly higher. The most common lifetime disorder type for all groups, this is lifetime disorder, is alcohol disorder, followed by anxiety disorders and then affective disorder. It is important to note here, however, that these populations are not entirely equivalent. I did mention this earlier, and results may differ if they were socio-demographically matched and statistically compared. A slightly different pattern emerges when we look at 12-month disorder. So while the ADF still report the highest rates of 12-month anxiety and affective disorders, both the ADF and the MFS report lower rates of 12-month alcohol disorder compared to the Australian population. Interestingly, although alcohol disorder was the most prevalent lifetime disorder type, it was the lowest 12-month disorder type. And so we think this is most accounted for by the zero alcohol disorder reported in the retained MFS group, so those people who were on call or in regional command. They pretty much reported no 12-month alcohol, and that's mostly because they're on call, and both the inability to drink while on deployment in the ADF, and also the random breath testing that occurs while in country in the Defence Force as well. So the following slides, I'm just going to take out the Australian comparison. I'm just going to look at the straight comparison of the fire service in the ADF. So for affective disorder, the most prevalent ICD-10 disorder type in both groups was depressive episodes, which accounted for the majority of the prevalence of affective disorder overall. The ADF reported the highest rates of all types of affective disorder. Similar to the ADF, the most prevalent anxiety disorder type in the MFS was post-traumatic stress disorder, with a 12-month prevalence of 5.8%. And this is followed by panic attacks, specific phobia, and social phobia. The high prevalence of specific phobia and panic attacks in both groups is interesting here, particularly in light of our other findings with the ADF, and it might indicate that panic attacks are a bit of a precursor to PTSD. It would actually be interesting to look at this data further to determine which type of specific phobia accounted for this difference. And this is because some of the previous work Sandy and I have done, looking at Ash Wednesday disaster-exposed population, has found that the environmental type phobias in adulthood, such as fear of storms, is much higher in the bushfire-exposed group versus those who weren't exposed to the bushfire, suggesting a possible link between aspects of the trauma and the feared stimuli. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, rates of 12-month alcohol disorder in both of these populations was very low, with the ADF reporting slightly higher rates than the MFS. So the final point I would like to make today relates to the predictability or expectation in relation to trauma type and the impact this has on mental health. And this was touched on earlier by Duncan Shields, who highlighted the impacts of unexpected events that cannot be protected against. This slide from the MFS study examines which workplace exposures are most highly related to current psychological distress. Interestingly and surprisingly, the events that are most highly associated with current psychological distress are call-outs involving injury to MFS members themselves and call-outs where the MFS member is required to attend an incident involving a member of the public who has mental health issues. Now, interestingly, these types of events, which I think possibly the MFS personnel feel the least equipped to deal with. MFS personnel are not mental health clinicians, therefore their ability to confidently assist someone with a mental health issue could potentially be limited. Similarly, sustaining an injury can potentially restrict the MFS member's ability to effectively complete the immediate task at hand and to effectively support their co-workers. Both of these have the potential to negatively impact the MFS member's identity and confidence, kind of like an identity injury. Unlike call-outs to multiple deaths or injuries, these are not the sort of events that firefighters expect to experience as a part of their daily routine, and nor are they necessarily the types of events they feel competent in dealing with. I think this also speaks to the moral injury debate which is happening at the moment and suggests the need to look at the issue of controllability and competence in relation to trauma exposure in the ADF, as it may be that the event types which are beyond the ADF members' control or expectation are most likely to be the ones that lead to poor outcomes. A similar pattern was observed in the ADF in 2010. In relation to the prevalence of lifetime trauma, the most prevalent event type in the ADF was seeing someone badly injured or killed and unexpectedly seeing a dead body. This type of trauma was experienced by 44% and 36% of the population respectively. Being exposed to combat or being a peacekeeper in a war zone or place of ongoing terror was also commonplace, with 1 in 3 ADF personnel being exposed to this type of traumatic event. Interpersonal traumas, such as rape and sexual assault, were less common, affecting between 5 and 10% of the population. However, the events with the highest reported prevalence in the ADF, i.e. seeing someone badly injured or killed, was not the events that led to the highest rates of PTSD. Instead, it is the events that are experienced less often, i.e. being kidnapped or held captive, being raped, being stalked, and all of these things are the ones that result in the largest proportion of people with PTSD. So this obviously has important implications for service delivery and screening in the ADF. Of the 20% of the MFS, over 20% of the MFS have experienced an automobile accident, some other life-threatening accident, or have been mugged. Over 8% have been sexually assaulted or have witnessed domestic violence. Though these rates are not substantially different from the Australian population, these events, combined with the multiple workplace exposures experienced within their MFS role, puts this workforce at considerable risk. Once again, here is the proportion of MFS experiencing each lifetime traumatic event who met criteria for PTSD, and you can see right down the bottom are the most common events: being purposely injured or purposely injuring or killed someone, accidentally hurting or killing someone, etc. And similar to the ADF, the event types which are most prevalent, namely seeing someone badly injured or killed, etc., are not the events that are most likely to lead to PTSD. Instead, it's the events that are not likely to occur in the context of their work. And these include things like accidentally hurting or injuring someone, sexual trauma, being physically assaulted. These are the types of events which are most likely to lead to PTSD in the Metropolitan Fire Service. This is ignoring the bottom two. The confidence intervals were a little bit wide on those two, so I couldn't be too confident about the estimates there. So finally, in addition to workplace exposures and lifetime trauma and occupational stress, in addition to workplace exposures and lifetime trauma, occupational stress, defined as the negative environmental factors or stresses, this is things like work overload, role ambiguity, poor working conditions, shift work, is recognised as a problem in firefighters. And we didn't look at this in the ADF, unfortunately, so I don't have comparative data. So not only are firefighters expected to cope with exposure to potentially traumatic events, they are also required to function effectively in an environment characterised by recurrent sleep disturbance, fatigue, and the need to remain on high alert. This can be an important contributing factor to poor mental health. For the MFS, the three most common sources of occupational stress were job skill concerns, co-worker conflict, and sleep issues, which were reported by approximately 80% of the population. Interestingly, 60% of MFS also reported stress related to a second job, indicating that a high proportion of individuals in this workforce have multiple concurrent occupations. Now, this is a very, very short, succinct summary here, but what does this all mean? Well, firstly, and most importantly, the professional context in which workplace trauma occurs is highly relevant. Both ADF and MFS personnel are highly exposed to a multitude of traumatic events on a regular basis, which are often beyond the realm of normal experience. However, they are highly trained and prepared to deal with these events, which is evidenced by the relatively low rates of disorder in this population and the lack of association between workplace trauma exposures and PTSD specifically. So the biggest risks for this group are events which are beyond the realm of their normal experience, and these are the things that should be flagged as potential risk factors. And I just need to acknowledge a number of parties. For the Metropolitan Fire Service, funding was received from an NH&MRC partnership grant. And I'd just like to thank the grant investigators, CTSS team, and obviously the South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service. And the mental health and wellbeing study that was conducted in 2010 also has a very long list of acknowledgements, but in particular I'd like to thank all the ADF personnel who completed this study. Thank you.